from the museum world joining us today, and they're going to talk about their careers and just kind of the museum field in general. And then afterwards, after they kind of do a little intro, each of them, we'll let you guys ask some questions. So be thinking of some good questions. We have Jenny. Well, this is actually, can you talk, Jenny? Because this is Alex. I'll do Alex first. This is Alex. She's a 2011 Center alum, and she is the Special Projects and Initiatives Coordinator of the Pacific Aviation Museum in Pearl Harbor. And a special thank you because it's 5:30 in the morning.
I'm so sorry.
Totally.
We also have, Jenny, can you say hello so you'll come up on the screen?
Yes. Hi. Hi there.
There you go. This is Jenny Rose Badgett. She's a 2009 Center alum. She was the former curatorial assistant at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and she's currently getting her PhD in art history at UC Santa Barbara, and then she plans to go back after her doctorate into curatorial. So it's only 8:30 there. Usually you would win being 3 hours earlier.
Well, I'm actually in Rhode Island.
Oh, okay. Well, you're.
So it's 11:30.
Okay, there we go. So Jenny's going to kick us off, and the floor is yours.
So, as Kirk said, I'm a 2009 grad, and I majored in history when I was at Center. While at Center, I did a number of internships. I studied abroad in London and interned at the British Museum during my study abroad program. I worked at the McDowell House for a semester. I did a Center term at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Birthplace. I did a couple of summer internships as well. And then an archaeological field school at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in Virginia, where I'm from originally. This summer I graduated. Graduating in 2009, little shaky in terms of the economy at the time. And so I made the decision to go right into a master's program, which I think higher education is sort of a fact of life. If you're interested in the museum field, I would say probably master's level definitely is a good idea. And so I got my MA in History and Museum Studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program in upstate New York, the 2-year program. And then after that, after a long job search, I was hired at the Detroit Institute of Arts as a curatorial assistant. And I worked there for about 3 years. Just to give you a little background on what I did there, as a curatorial assistant, I really worked between a number of departments. So I provided administrative support to the department head for European art, but also worked with the American department on an exhibition called Watch Me Move, which was an animation exhibition. And I did a little work with their prints and photographs department, an exhibition in that department. I did research, I worked with membership groups, so just sort of the whole gamut of curatorial work. And then in 2014, I decided to go back to grad school yet again, because I realized that especially at a mid to large size art museum, it's really hard to get an assistant curator position or a full curator position without a PhD. And so I am 3 years into my PhD at UC Santa Barbara. I finished my coursework and exams, and so now I'm working on my dissertation. As I mentioned, I'm living in Rhode Island, so after a certain point in your PhD, you don't have to be a residential student anymore. And so my husband works in Massachusetts, and so that's why we're here. But all of my archives are on the East Coast too, so that's been really fortuitous for us. A couple of things that I wish someone had told me or did tell me as I was entering the museum field that you all might find helpful. Museums, there are a lot of different museum jobs. I think a lot of people automatically think curatorial, oh, I want to be a curator. But as Alex will share with us here in a minute, like there are a wide range of things that you could do in a museum context. And I think the types of museum jobs are also expanding and growing as museums become more community and visitor focused. So outside of curatorial, there's education, there's fundraising, public outreach, programming, all sorts of things. Internships are so important for sort of launching your career. Also, it's important, I think, to hone your communication skills, both in terms of public speaking and writing. And so those are sort of like skill-based points I would make. And then in terms of sort of actionables, getting involved in your either local or regional or even national organizations can be helpful. So the American Alliance of Museums is one, the American Association for State and Local History, the College Art Association, if you're an art history major. Visiting museums is sort of an obvious, and I'm sure if you're interested in museum work, you probably already do this, but not only visiting them, but finding ways to become conversant about what you've seen, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you thought was effective, because those are things that you can incorporate into interviews, or you might even be asked about as you're interviewing for positions. As my career demonstrates, and I think Alex might touch on this too, I think a willingness to relocate, and sometimes to less desirable places far from home. I certainly never imagined I would be living and working in downtown Detroit. I loved it. I think Detroit has a terrible reputation for those who haven't visited. And related to that, when I was at the Detroit Institute of Arts, the city was going through their bankruptcy proceedings, and the DIA's collection was and is owned by the city, so that made for a very tumultuous period of time working there. So I think it's really important, especially in the nonprofit world, to know the financial health of an institution before you accept a position. And one way to do this is to look up your nonprofit's 990 tax form, which sounds really boring stuff, but when you're out of college and depending upon a paycheck to sort of sustain yourselves, it's important to know these things going in. Yeah, I'll close my segment and let Alex talk for a minute, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you all for being here today. This is how I started out in the field myself, sort of going and talking to people. So I just think it's so important. So thank you.
I guess I'll go ahead and start. I'm Alex Skies. I graduated in 2011. I was an art history and French double major, actually. So kind of funny that Jenny was a history major and ended up in an art museum. I was an art history major and ended up in a history museum. But yeah, so I graduated in 2011. I was not prepared to go to grad school following graduation. Not that I don't think I could have cut it out. I wasn't really ready to sign on for more school after finishing up at Center. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the various English teaching assistant programs available abroad. But I had a good friend who graduated the year before me who got me interested in that. So I taught English in France following graduation in 2011. And then I still wasn't quite ready to go to grad school, so I actually came back and worked at Center for 2 years. I worked in the admission office there as the Welcome Center coordinator. So if you're ever, they're still an old center. They're upstairs, the Welcome Center upstairs, an old center. When I was there, it was downstairs, but worked there for 2 years, and then decided I was ready to go get my master's, but I didn't really want to stay in the US to get my degree, so I started looking at programs abroad. I ended up finding a one-year master's in London at University College London at their Institute of Education. It's an MA in Museums and Galleries and Education. When I was at Center, I did several internships, like similar to Jenny. I started actually at the local community arts center there, making lesson plans, just working generally throughout various departments at the community arts center. Then center term of my junior year, I did an internship between the curatorial and education departments at the Dayton Art Institute in Ohio. And then following that following summer, I interned at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in the education department. And so kind of through all of that, I just decided that I was interested in museum education specifically. So I started looking for programs in museum education, and that's how I came across the program in London. That was an amazing program. One piece of advice I would say is think outside the box. If you're looking at grad school, you don't have to go to school in the US. There are lots of amazing programs out there, and London in particular, and the UK in general, have very, really wonderful programs in museum careers. And so while I was in London, I was able to volunteer at the Benjamin Franklin House there. I volunteered at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum. And then we did a work, like a work study kind of work program through the MA program as well. So I did that at the Victoria and Albert Museum as well, kind of an internship type thing. And so I got a lot of really great experience there. I really wanted to stay in London when I finished my program. I loved that city, and I made a lot of good friends. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to get a work visa in the UK unless you have a very specific specialty or you're getting married, and even that's not easy. And so I had to start looking at other options. I did stay in the UK for about 6 weeks after my program finished trying to find work, but it just wasn't happening. And so, like Jenny said, be willing to relocate. So I started thinking about anywhere in the US that I wanted to move. I didn't really want to go, Northeast. I'm not a big fan of winter, which is maybe seems like a dumb thing to consider, but you have to really think about where you'd be willing to live. And so I didn't really want to go Northeast. So I started looking on the West Coast, the South, looking for any kind of careers in the museum world that I felt I was qualified for, and found a position that was open at the Art Museum in Honolulu. I had a friend that I graduated from Center with who was living here at the time, and called him up and was like, can I sleep on your couch until I find a job? And so I did a phone interview with the Art Museum, didn't get that position. They notified me about another position that they had opened up, all of this before I left London. I decided I was just going to come to Honolulu, give it a shot, see what happens. Came to Honolulu, did an interview in person with them, still didn't get that position. So I decided I was going to still try and make it work in Hawaii because I really liked it here. Shocking, I'm sure. And so I got a position at Apple, a part-time position at Apple. I found a work trade program, a work trade job at a hostel. So I was living in a hostel for free while working there part-time. I moved in November of 2015. This was December of 2015. By January 2016, I found a part-time museum educator position at Pacific Aviation Museum. And so they brought me on part-time as an independent contractor, which is something I'll talk about in a second, freelance work. They brought me on as an independent contractor in January 2016. So from January until March, I was working all three jobs. I was doing hostel, Apple, and the museum. And then March, I was able to move out of the hostel and get an apartment. So then I was working Apple and the museum. In May, they brought me on full-time. They created a position for me full-time in May 2015 or 2016. And so I worked at the museum and Apple, full-time at the museum, part-time at Apple until August or September. And then I left Apple finally. So long winding road. That's something I was going to mention as far as the general overview of the field, is that there is no set path in the museum field at all. Unlike being a doctor or a lawyer, where it's very clear cut, like you go to school, you go to law school, you go, on and on and on. There's a very kind of clear defined path in those fields. That is not the case in the museum field. It's becoming, especially in museum education has grown as a profession quite a bit. The focus of museums has changed a lot from kind of collections to the audience. So education in museums has grown quite a bit. So if you're interested in that, you're in a good place. Yeah, so it's growing, but there is no one set path. I work in a history museum, Pacific Aviation Museum, Pearl Harbor, in the education department specifically. I am the only full-time staff member with a museum-specific degree. Everyone else either has history degree, teaching degree, aviation background, or military background. So I'm the only person in that department with museum education specific degree. But that was something that they really liked about my experience. So, and that's been the case in pretty much every museum that I've worked in. Everyone has very varied backgrounds. So another thing I was going to recommend is don't be afraid, not only in thinking outside the box as far as looking for master's or doctorate degrees, but also be willing to think outside the box as far as the kind of jobs you're willing to take, because you never know what kind of experience will be applicable to a job that you want down the line. I never imagined that I'd end up back at Center working in admission. It wasn't something I kind of helped out with admission when I was a student there. I hosted overnight students and that kind of stuff, but I was never like, I'm going to work in admission. I want to recruit people to come to Center. But I really loved that job, and the experience that I had there was really beneficial to getting into my master's program. It was really beneficial to getting this job because I got some event planning experience at Center that has been really useful in the job that I have now. I guess I could explain what I do. I plan special events for the museum that are specific to education. So anything outside of our normal programming, like our field trip programs, our outreach programs, anything outside of that stuff falls under my kind of responsibility. So planning, we have a big event every year called Living History Day, which is kind of like a living history festival that we hold at the museum. I plan Discover Your Future in Aviation, which is kind of like a career and college fair for people, for students and adults who are looking for a career change. Again, that museum or that Center admission, job really came in handy for that kind of planning. So anything like that is kind of falls under my duties. Trying to think if there's anything else. Internships, like Jenny said, huge help for me. You just kind of continue to build on your experience, and that is really what helps kind of set you apart from other applicants when you're looking for jobs or looking to get into grad school. And utilizing your network. I mean, Center is so great about keeping people in touch with each other and like reaching out if you're looking for an alum in a particular field, like this kind of thing, and keeping in touch with people from your internships and previous jobs and stuff. The museum field, it can be kind of difficult, like in certain institutions, to get your foot in the door. And so it's really good to hold on to those connections once you have them, because you never know who knows someone at the next museum that you're trying to find a job in. Being willing to relocate is a big thing, because there are lots of museums all over the place. They won't necessarily be hiring in the city that you live in, so you should be willing to kind of look outside where you're living if you really want to look for a museum career. I think that's basically it. That was a really long spiel. Yeah, I don't know if there's any, at this point, if we're supposed to talk about anything else or if we're supposed to start taking questions.
We're open for questions. Thank you both. Very good information. Anybody have any questions? Don't be shy. This is your chance. Talk to the experts.
How did you guys decide museum work was for you? I mean, you guys are both history and art. There's other options out there, right? But how did you decide on museums?
I started as a studio art, or I thought I was going to start out as a studio art major. For me, it was kind of, I took an online art history class in high school that I hated. So when I came to Center, I was not really interested in art history at all, as far as like a career goes. And then as a studio major, you're required to take an art history class. And I just really loved my class. I'm really sad that you guys, as art history students, have missed out on having Dr. Levin. I loved him. He was a really good mentor for me. And that really inspired me to start looking into art history. And then as I did more and more internships, it's I didn't really want to teach. I like education, but I don't particularly like working in a classroom. And so I knew I didn't want to work as a teacher. I didn't want to get my doctorate in art history and be a professor or teach in high school or anything like that. And teaching English in France solidified that decision. So it kind of was an organic process. It just kind of happened that way as far as the experience I got.
And for me, I was always really interested in history, but and not only history, but artifacts, right? So objects. And so that's what initially drew me to the museum field. I remember I was a junior in high school, and I went to an exhibition at Colonial Williamsburg, their decorative arts museum, and it like hit me. Like, I still remember this. I was like, wait a second. I could do this. Like, I could organize exhibitions and do the research behind it. Like, that's a career path. And so then, when I was at Center, I explored internships and more ways to get involved in the field. To touch on a little bit my shift from history to art history, my department, it's not always, art history is a really broad field, and fortunately for me, at UC Santa Barbara, the art history department is both art and architecture, but my professor, my advisor, which is why I ended up at UCSB, really has balanced his career between academia and museum work, which is kind of rare. Most people, will just focus in one area. And so it's hard to find really strong mentors who have museum careers and real museum experience in academia. But my department is really inclusive, and so material culture, craft, like all of those fall under the broader art history heading. It's not sort of strict, just fine arts sort of training. But after working at the DIA in an art museum, sort of being my first full-time professional position, that sort of shifted me more toward art history. But I think when I'm done with my PhD, I'll have degrees in 3 different fields: history from Center, museum studies, and then art history. So I'm hoping that, as Alex, as her career also demonstrates, getting a degree in one field doesn't necessarily exclude you from being able to work in a history museum or to work in an art history museum. The skills are are transferable. And I wanted to pick up on something that Alex said earlier. The museum field is super competitive. And don't be discouraged when you're not getting an interview, or you get interviews and you don't get the job. I started applying for positions when I had finished my master's in December of 2010, because I graduated with my master's in 2011. Started applying for positions in December, and then I worked as a consultant over the summer for a historic house museum in Virginia, but didn't get the DIA position until I was interviewing in October, and I started in November. So it's sort of, you have to be you have to be committed, and you have to be willing to sort of take the bumps along the way, and just know that your persistence will eventually pay off.
I forgot, I was gonna touch back on that because I mentioned I started as an independent contractor at the museum that I'm at now, and that's something that is really big in the museum world. It's kind of freelance work. So if you're okay with it, be willing to kind of take little jobs here and there. Freelance work is, where you're hired on as like a consultant, or you're hired on for one particular project, or like in the UK, maternity cover is a really big thing. And so just be willing to take kind of contracted positions, because it gives you really good experience, and you can sometimes be hired internally if they have an opening. So that's a way to get your foot in the door.
Any other questions?
So, what is the most important factor to get admitted into an institution? Like, is that internship or a degree in that field?
You mean for grad school?
No, for
Oh, to get a job.
yes.
What was, like, she kind of cut out for.
What are the most important factors in getting a job,
Yeah.
like being hired? Are they internships, or is it your degree, is it other things?
I would say, internships are super important. But I think this is not at all helpful, but it's true. The hiring process, for internships, fellowships, full-time positions, whatever, is highly subjective. And it just is. Like, it depends on who else is applying, and who's looking at your application, and, what are the internal politics going on at that institution at that moment. Because you can be a highly qualified candidate and still not get an interview, because it's just that competitive. And I think and I still tell myself this, like, it really is, it's very subjective. And I know that's not helpful when you're wanting to get into the field, but I do think it's helpful when you're sending out applications and you're not hearing back and not getting the news that you want to hear, to just realize that it's not you, and to keep trying. And, eventually things have a way of working themselves out. But I think, the more you can intern, the more you can network. I think it's a combination of that. And interning helps with networking too, because the more people you know in the field, people can let you know about positions, or, put in a good word for you. I think there's been a number of cases for internships for me where, I've had sort of an inside connection, like someone knew someone who knew someone who could put in a good word. And so all of those things help. But, it's a competitive field. And I don't see that changing.
I totally agree with that. There have been a lot of times. When I moved from London, I was applying all over the country, and it's in many places I never heard anything back. And I felt like I had a pretty decent amount of experience behind me and a new, like, shiny degree. And so it can be discouraging, and especially when you kind of feel like a little bit desperate, that can be really challenging. But yeah, like she was saying, it's important to just stay persistent. Like I said, I was working 3 jobs for like several months, because I wanted to prove to the museum here that I was committed to the work that I was doing. And, it paid off in the end. I would say, in addition to internships, be willing to volunteer at places. Lots of museums are looking for volunteers, and it's kind of like, it's not the bottom of the ladder, but, it's open. There are more opportunities for volunteering maybe than internships or jobs, full-time jobs. And so it's a good way to, again, network, make your face known at an institution, and, really get to know a museum. That if there's a museum that you love, that you would like to be able to kind of visit more often or learn more about, it's a really good way to do that, because a lot of times there are perks to being a volunteer. You get free admission. Sometimes you get free admission into special exhibitions. In London, when I was volunteering at the V&A, in London, in the UK, all museums are free admission, but special exhibitions cost an arm and a leg sometimes. And so as a V&A volunteer, not even for my internship, just as because I volunteered there as well as a front of house volunteer, you get into exhibitions at the other museums in London for free. And so that was a really fantastic way for me to go and see what else was happening in the city at the time, and keep up with kind of what was going on in that world, in the museum world. And so I would say definitely be willing to try that as well, because you never know what kind of opportunities might pop up while you're volunteering at an institution. Any other questions?
I have a question. So when y'all are talking about internships and contract work and all that kind of stuff, which sounds like a good way to get in, get experience, get some skills, what would be some of the particular things to emphasize in applying for those positions that might separate you from just the run-of-the-mill candidate? And I'm sure it may vary based on territorial versus education positions, but could each of y'all speak to that?
I would say, especially if I know at Center Study Abroad is a huge thing. I think it's a really good way to show a place, a museum, that you are kind of a global citizen. That sounds really cheesy, but museums are all about understanding the history of cultures and places. And so if you can kind of show that you've had experience in another country and you have the ability to understand and live in another culture, that is a huge thing, I think. Research and writing, probably Jenny would say, for curatorial, and at Center, that's a big skill that you have to develop at Center. So that's something that you can show in your cover letter, or if they ask for writing samples or things like that, pick your best paper from your history class or whatever. That kind of stuff can be really important. And then, things that would set you apart, because a lot of times, it is very competitive, like Jenny was saying. It's so you want to find things that set you apart and make you unique to that institution, and unique hobbies or extracurriculars you're involved with at Center, things that might not on the surface seem like they relate to the position, but could in some way help make you the best candidate for that job, for that internship.
And I think too, from the jump, when you're applying for things, it's important to have a sense and to demonstrate this in a cover letter as to how you fit into that institution and that institutional culture as best as you can discern, by doing some research based on their website, or, by, if you have a chance to talk to someone before you're applying for the position. Informational interviews are also a good way to learn about institutions and job titles, and there's less pressure because you're not, it's networking. You're not applying for a job specifically at the institution, but you're just gathering more information. And I think, personality goes a long way too, in terms of museum work, because so much of it is teamwork and collaborative. And so, it's, if there's any way you can sort of emphasize that or make that come out in your cover letter and application materials, I think that's super important. Because museums aren't looking for people who can't work well with others. So that's what I would say.
That actually we literally just like a week ago held phone interviews with some intern applicants for the summer, and my boss was saying, one thing that's really important, even though it sounds superficial in a way, is that there's like chemistry. They're going to want to hire people that, are like-minded and click well with the team, like Jenny was saying, and that's not always within your control. Obviously, you're not going to know necessarily going in what the dynamic is like in a museum, but trying to find places that really, interest you and you're passionate about. would be really helpful, because obviously people that are working there are going to have a similar kind of personality and passion. So, you know, I would say be open to looking outside, you know, thinking outside the box, looking at places you might not expect, but also look for places that you're really excited about, because that will come through in your application and your interview.
Yeah, I think that Alex has hit on a great point. Passion is really important. Burnout is a real concern within the museum field. And so if in your application materials, or as they're looking through things, they're sensing a candidate is less excited, you know, then what's going to be the situation 6 months down the line or more, when you've got competing deadlines and, you know, you're in an organization that's short-staffed and a lot's demanded of you. So I think passion goes a long way, like just from the interview process forward. So it's important, and it's important to be passionate about the field, because as you know, I think Alex and I have both stated, like it's not the most direct or easiest career path, and it sometimes requires quite a lot of self-sacrifice. So you have to really love what you're doing and want to do it day after day, regardless of some of the downsides.
What would you say some of the downsides are?
Oh, well, so I think,
but it's curious you mentioned that. I'm curious about what you guys consider kind of the not so happy parts of the job.
So that's a great question, and I think at this point in my career and in the career of sort of my grad school, my master's program colleagues, you know, we've been in the field for a couple of years now. The rose-colored glasses are sort of coming off. I think for curatorial, one downside is just the amount of education required to get, you know, beyond a curatorial assistant position. It's a huge time commitment. I mean, years. A PhD takes 5 to 7 years. You know, unlike medical degrees, you're not going to come out making the same sort of money at all. It's possible to make a comfortable salary, but you're not making tons of money. It's just, you know, nonprofit work. And I think, I think that's maybe one of the salary is a downside, and the amount of education required to sort of hit that, you know, to really advance your career.
I would totally agree with that. I mean, you're not going into any sort of nonprofit career expecting to make a lot of money. And just be aware that it is a hard fact of being in this kind of position, in this kind of field. You're not going to be making a lot of money, regardless of what position you're in. And so that's important to consider, especially, you know, for me, it was and has been, continues to be a challenge to live in Honolulu, which has one of the highest costs of living in the country, working on a museum educator salary. So, you know, that's why I had 3 jobs for so long. That's why I kept Apple for as long as I could after I was given a full-time position at the museum, because you know, you're not making a lot of money. Thankfully, in my case anyway, I have lots of good benefits, so that's helpful. But yeah, that is definitely something that's kind of a downside. I would say too, a lot of places, it can feel in museums, it can feel cliquey, which is kind of like a silly thing. And I would say that that's true. I mean, every industry, every kind of job you're going to have will have politics involved. Every single thing that you do, and regardless of whether it's museum industry or not. But it can be, because the museum industry is very competitive. You know, I would say that certain areas, certain departments, or certain you know, museums they're hard to get into. If you get into them, like, it's a good thing, but then even once you're in, it can be kind of cliquey. So it can be hard to kind of feel like you're in high school a little bit sometimes. But again, I don't think that's unique to the museum field. I think that's just a fact of being a professional in various types of industries. But I would say that's one thing that I noticed kind of working in a lot of different kinds of places, that it's the case in pretty much all museums, at least that I've had experience with.
Well, I think just in the nonprofit world in general, certain things are just subject to the whims of the economy, and you have to sort of realize that and, be prepared for that. Which is why I mentioned the 990 tax form. It seems really silly, but, and I could have, and I say that mainly because I didn't pull Detroit's 990 tax form. And that would have maybe set off some red flags in terms of the size of their endowment. Now, would I have not accepted that position if I knew that they had a really small endowment? No, I would have still gone because it was a great sort of entry-level curatorial position. But it's just good, the more you can know about an institution going in, the better.
And I would say also the competitiveness, the kind of the difficulty of getting your foot in the door can be a frustration, like we were talking about before. But I would say, like we've been saying, just keep trying. It'll happen eventually. Or maybe you'll find something that's not a museum. Like maybe you think you're interested in a museum career, and because you can't find a position in a museum, you find something else, and it turns out to be like the best position you could ever find for yourself. So, you never really know what's going to happen. I never, ever in my wildest dreams when I was at student at Center or even working at Center would have imagined that I would be living in Honolulu working at Pearl Harbor. Like that was never anything within my realm of possibility when I was a student. So you never know, what's going to happen down the line. So I would say just be open to any kind of opportunity that presents itself and see where it takes you, because you never know where you could end up. So.
Yeah, flexibility is so, so important.
Any other questions?
So how did you do the researching process for jobs? Like, where did you start for a job?
Earlier, Ginny mentioned the American Alliance of Museums. They have a really great job headquarters, so you can search for open positions in museums all over the country. You can look and see. You can even choose, filter, different departments, different kinds of positions. In the UK, the Leicester Jobs Desk is a really good one. They post all kinds of museum openings. And then looking at museum websites specifically, a lot of times, if there's a particular museum that you're interested in, or you're living in a city, there's a couple of museums, or, there's a city you want to move to. That was something that I always did, is if there was a particular state or particular city I was interested in living in, I would just Google a list of museums and then go to their individual websites and look for. Not all of them, especially some of the smaller ones, are going to be posting on those big job sites like the AAM and stuff like that. So looking at individual websites is a good way to do it too.
Yeah, that's exactly how I found the position in Detroit. It was on their, employment page, and it wasn't advertised elsewhere. So that can be sort of a good trick if you're trying to, work at a great institution that maybe isn't going to pony up the money it costs to post to national websites. And those positions tend to get less applicants because they're less publicized. But I think so. So individual websites, as Alex said. Also, there's the University of Delaware, excuse me, puts out a weekly newsletter, museum studies newsletter. And so that lists jobs and conferences and internships. That's one of the ones that I'm following now. And when I was looking for jobs after my master's, every week, I would go through a bunch of websites that I'd bookmarked, and I'd look for new postings, and I would apply. but there are many, the more ways you can, and you'll notice cross listings, but yeah, there are a bunch of professional organizations are a good place to start, and then individual websites for museums too.
Last chance. Well, this is great information, very thorough. Do you guys have any parting thoughts for us? And you don't have to, you can just.
No, I would say, like we've been saying, just, be persistent. It is competitive, but like I said, it'll work out in the end one way or another. A lot of times, especially if you're having a hard time, it can feel like, it's never going to happen for you, or it's really, it can be really stressful. The job hunt can be really, really stressful. And so try to just keep going. And like I said, be willing to do stuff that you might not think of. Be willing to be a volunteer first and find a part-time job at Apple, and then make your way into the museum, in another way. So just be willing to think outside the box as far as jobs go.
Yeah, I would second what Alex said, and just know too that it's not you. Don't take it personally when you're not getting an interview or a job, and be confident in the skills and the education that you've gotten at Center, and things have a way of working out. But not to end on sort of a down note, I think museums are a really exciting field, and it's unlike any other. I really do think that museums are essential to healthy communities, and they make the world a better place. So if you're passionate about them, it can be a really, really great, exciting, and rewarding career. And I think that, Alex and I are both doing this because we believe in museums and, have.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I was like, we wouldn't both be in this chat right now if we didn't love what we were doing and want to keep doing it, despite, some of the hardships. So it is worth it in the end. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, and I'll also add, Kirk has my contact information. If any of you have questions afterwards, I'm happy to continue this chat via email. I really love, it was really important to me as a student to sit down and talk with people in the field. And so I'm excited to be at a point where I can try to impart some wisdom.
Yeah, totally. Like I said before, utilize your network. We're both in your network now. So feel free to reach out and ask us questions or, advice. That's what Center is all about, is that community. So use it.
Well, thank you both very much for your time.
I have a couple things. So in the community, we have a lot of opportunities, strangely. You think that Danville's too small.